So Dr. Claudia Spadazzi is a full member of the Italian Psychoanalytical Society. She is a clinical psychologist, gynecologist, and sexual therapist. She is a visiting professor in psychosomatic gynecology at Università Politecnica del Marche. She has been part of the IPA committee, or IPA IPSO, COWAP, and public information. She is interested in neurosciences, psychosomatics, and female psychosexuality. She is the co-founder of the Italian Psychoanalytic Dialogues Association, and I'm so proud to introduce her. So, Claudia, go on with your way of interpreting this wonderful case.
Thank you, Irith. Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm glad to have the opportunity to discuss this amazing case presented by Rosa. And I'm glad to talk with you, with all the audience, and with you, Irith. And thank you for having graciously accepted to chair this webinar with Paul, who's talking to us from our marvelous island, and with Francesco and with Rosa. And Rosa, who accepted to present this case, which for us as neuropsychoanalysts is particularly interesting, I think, because as neuropsychoanalysts, we try to combine our knowledge of psychodynamic mechanisms of the mind together with the neurologic aspects of mental problems, and trying to enrich both disciplines. And this particular case that Rosa just presented to us shows a particular neurologic situation. This symptom, the main symptom that this patient presents, I think is really challenging. This symptom we call eutoscopy. I don't know if you are familiar with it because it is quite rare in psychotherapy to face this symptom. Let's go a little bit into it. I will try to share my slides. Let's see. Can you see them?
Not yet.
Yes. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Can.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So I was speaking, yes, about eutoscopy. This symptom has been described since 1935 by this German neuropsychiatrist Menninger Lerchenthal. He's not related with the Menninger of the United States, Carl Menninger, the Kansas psychiatrist. And he first described this symptom. And as Rosa mentioned, at the moment, eutoscopic phenomena are divided in these three different situations. Let's look at it for a moment. Otoscopic hallucination, when the subject can see the body from an external point of view. There is this situation, but the self knows about himself and sees the other one. The out-of-body experience, as you can see, is probably something that you have personally experienced it in your life, in dreams, or maybe in your patient's dreams, when the body is seen from a visual elevated perspective. And it also happens during the assumption of some drugs, for example, ketamine. So the body can be seen from a higher position. But in the one which Rosa's patients presents is the central one, the eutoscopy, in which it's a highly realistic perception, and the subject perceives himself split in two different selves, and he doesn't know which one is the right one. So I think it's a very disquieting symptom, can be really terrifying. And we can also wonder what happens from a counter-transferential point of view to the analyst, because of course, it must be very confusing and challenging also for the analyst. This perception of being split into selves has been widely described also in literature. There are many writers that have written about this perception of the double. Maybe the most famous of them is Dostoevsky, who wrote this very famous novel, which is The Double, in which he described very clearly the perception of eutoscopy. And maybe this was due to the fact that Dostoevsky suffered from epileptic seizures, in particular a temporal epilepsy. And so maybe this is why he was able to describe so clearly the perception of a double self. We know that Freud disagreed with, was not convinced about Dostoevsky epilepsy. This novel was written in 1848, if I remember well. And of course, we will never know the truth, because at the time there were no instrumental symptoms, instrumental possibility of diagnosis. But Freud spoke about a kind of hysteroepilepsy, so underlining that the mental aspect could bring Dostoevsky to have this kind of perception, namely the otoscopic symptom. In the case of Rosa's patient, maybe it was a bit of the same situation, because we know he underwent to several instrumental diagnosis, such as RMI and electroencephalography, and they were all negative. So it was not a symptom due to a lesion, but it was probably due to his psychic situation. Usually, eutoscopy is related to a lesion in the temporoparietal junction, and it is due to a lesion there, neoplastic or vascular, or to an epileptic seizure of the temporal area, so of the temporal lobe. So we know that in Rosa's case, this was not the case, and also that it was a functional disturbance, because also during the treatment, the symptom modified and then disappeared. So we were not in presence of a lesion, as I was saying, but it was a functional problem. A problem of self-consciousness disturbance, as Rosa called it. And while speaking of self-consciousness disturbance, it came to my mind the situation of the concept of the self as conceptualized by Ramachandran. I don't know if you are familiar with this thought. For those of you who attended the Rome 2018 conference, he mentioned his concept of the self. And these are the main characteristics: continuity, coherence of self, sense of embodiment, sense of agency, and self-awareness. And according to Ramachandran, imagine these characteristics like a big table with 5 legs. If one leg is wobbly, then the table is still there, but if all the legs are wobbling, then the the table will fall down, and this is more or less what happened to Rosa's patients. Let's see them one by one. Continuity, so the sense of unbroken thread through the whole fabric of experience with the accompanying feeling of the past, of the present, and of the future. These are the words of Ramachandran, and yes, of course we know that we need to be anchored to our past and to know about the present, to be able to project into the future, and this is what the patient is not able to do. Let's see his words. It's terrible because I changed together with space and time, and I am a different person. I'm another person. I perceive myself differently. I do not recognize myself. And let's go to the next one, which is unity or coherence of self. Of course, each of us, we have our own thoughts and experiences and desires and beliefs and feelings and emotions, and we perceive them as a unity. But if this unity is lost, then we feel ourselves in a total confusion, and we can keep this unity even if you are in this continuous changes of perception from the external world, but in the internal world, the unity of the self is stable. And if we lose this stability, this the self is impaired. And again, let's see the patient. He says it's like having a different vision of yourself in which you do not recognize yourself. It's a physical sensation. I'm not myself and I don't know where I am. And then the third one is the sense of embodiment. Maybe this is the characteristic which is more impaired in Rosa's patients. We all the time we feel ourselves anchored to our body, while this patient came to my mind, an astronaut floating in the universe is totally disembodied. And let's see what he says. My body is not here with me where I am. And also he loses the perception, the bodily perception. Let's see, am I cold, hungry, full? You see how this perception, we know that he touches himself all the time, he pinches himself, trying to restore some perception, some bodily perception. It's a bit like people who are self-cutting in order to restore the borders of the body. And he says, not only my body is elsewhere and not with me, but even when it is here with me, I do not understand. So he feels totally disembodied, and he loses his contact with the body. And this is really a disquieting experience. And then the fourth is sense of agency, the ownership, being in charge of our own actions and destinies. Of course, during our life, we feel our destiny, more or less, we feel that our destiny is in our hands, and we are able to do actions to change the present and to change our future. And in these patients, no, he doesn't feel that he has this sense of ownership. And let's see what he says. He says, while I'm doing something, I know that I am the one who is doing it, but at the same time, I perceive myself elsewhere as if I was not acting. So you see how the sense of agency is confused, and again, this leg is wobbly, going to Ramachandra metaphor of the table. And finally, there is a self-awareness, the capacity of meta-representation. So the possibility of a higher order representation. I think this one is a little bit, I don't know, Rosa, what do you think, is best kept among the legs of the table, so to say. Because look, he says, I do not understand, is it my body that is somewhere else? and I can't not attribute my thoughts to it, or is it the mind which is elsewhere? So you see, there is a kind of reflection about the self, even if the self is split into different selves. But of course, as neuropsychoanalysts, we cannot accept anymore this distinction between body and mind, but it is very common in the Western culture, so this is not the point. The point is that anyway, this patient is capable of some reflection about his self, and so the perception of two selves is still more painful, I think. And so about the pain, I would like to conclude with a question to the audience and to the speakers, of course, about self-medication, because I think that if this patient would be a patient of mine, I would put him in under medication, antipsychotic medication, in order to reduce the anxiety, because to me it seems to be a psychotic anxiety, and trying to reduce the importance, the relevance of the symptom. I don't know if this would be right, because probably to work about the disturbance, the self-consciousness disturbance, this would be maybe more confusing, but on the other way, maybe it would be better. I don't think that there is a right answer to this question, also because in literature there are very few cases, and all the cases are related to lesions or to epilepsy. But still, I would like to discuss this with you, because I think it is an important question. So if you go back to the characteristic of the self, or in other words, if you think to Antonio Damasio's thought, to the extended consciousness, we can see how working, as Rosa did, on the with this patient, with the concept of self disturbance consciousness, was probably the best way to treat him. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'm applauding in the name of everyone.
Thank you,
Claudia.
thank you, Irith. Thank you, Irith.
And we'll hold in mind your presentation and your question as well. And we're going straight immediately, because we are a bit stressed with time, to Paul. Please, Paul, let me just introduce you in a minute. All right. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Paul Moore, who is a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist in private practice in Ireland. He is course director of the MM Science in Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy in the Department of Psychiatry, School of Medicine, Trinity College, Dublin, and lecturer in psychoanalysis and neuropsychoanalysis in Trinity College and other third-level educational institutes. Paul is a former chair of the Irish Institute of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy and is also a training analyst for the IPD. He is a founding member and group leader of Neuropsychoanalysis Ireland. In addition to general practice in psychotherapy, Paul specializes in psychotherapy for people who have experienced a brain injury, people on the autistic spectrum, and collaborates with Professor Oliver Turnbull's Emotion Research Lab at Bangor University, New South Wales, where the team are investigating the neural correlates of psychotherapy. In this context, Paul has worked psychoanalytically, both long-term and short-term, with people who have profound amnesia as a consequence of brain injury. And I'm so happy to introduce Paul, a very good friend of neuropsychoanalysis and a very good lecturer and writer as well. He didn't mention everything, but here it is. So please, Paul, come on.
You're very kind, Irith. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm just going to try share my screen. Hopefully it will let me do this.
All right.
Okay, so first of all, good morning and hello again to Rosa, Claudia, Irith and Francesco. It's lovely to be finally here with you, sitting at this virtual roundtable, and thank you, Rosa, for inviting me to be part of the thinking with you about your work with A. And it's important, I think, to take a moment to thank you and A for sharing this work with us. It's such a generous and important thing to do, as it provides us with a wonderful opportunity to learn and to further our knowledge, interest and study in the life of the mind. And what a fascinating subject. So let me just say a little bit about my presentation. It's not a lecture, it's a response more than a presentation. It is my associations, as it were, from a neuropsychoanalytic perspective to Rosa and A's work together. And my process of trying to understand how this way of being a mind came to pass and what it must have been like to be A. This is something I think all psychoanalytic practitioners do. What I'm going to talk about in 20 minutes, hopefully I'll get it all in, is intended to be in large part a stimulus for our broader conversation together.
So Paul, I was asked to remind you to speak slowly. So
yeah, I'm trying to. I know.
Everyone will understand.
We us Irish are like our Italian colleagues. When we're interested in something, we speak very quickly when we're passionate about something. So I will make an extra effort to slow down.
So you might see my hand coming up sometimes, and you will know.
Thank you, Irith. Okay, so my thought process went something like this. The different ways in which psychoanalysis tries to understand what it is to be an experiencing subjective I, what it is to be and to have a self. How then does this subjective self relate to itself as an object in the world? How does the process of perceiving, knowing and understanding our corporeal bodies come to pass? How and where does this happen in the nervous system? What structures and mechanisms in what we call in neuropsychoanalysis the brain-mind are involved in this process of being and observing ourselves? Importantly then, how does information about ourselves get into our brain minds? And how does it grow and develop? What factors might be involved developmentally and that lead to autoscopic phenomena, particularly the heutoscopic phenomena experienced by A. So let's begin with Freud. Throughout his writings, Freud used the German word ich to refer to what we colloquially call the self, the experiencing I. Ich literally means I, although translated by Strachey as ego. Freud wrote and developed a complex construct of self with many facets and capabilities. He constructed two major topographies. The first, a geographical model of unconscious, pre-conscious and conscious territories of the mind. The second, second topography was more dynamic and interactional, containing agencies more than territories, consisting of id, ego and superego. When Freud conceived of the origins of the self, he envisaged there being nothing initially, no experiencing ego, but through the state and process of what he termed primary narcissism, a psychical energy, what he referred to as a quota of affect in his project for scientific psychology, the borders of self and other come to be defined. These borders arose from the interaction between the baby's biological needs and the environment mainly being the mother, and the frustration experienced at these needs not being met quickly enough. This process allowed for what Freud termed the narcissistic libidinal investment or cathexis of the body. The delineation between self and other begins a subjective self, experiencing itself, an internal representation of the external world, in particular the bodily self. And we can think of this as early hippocampal function, and I'll say some more about that. So psychoanalysis is not only Freud, and later practitioners and theorists developed different ideas of self. Melanie Klein observed through her work with children, and particularly their play, what she thought of as a primitive ego being present, and very early process of identification and introjection that established a very rich internal world in the child, populated with internal objects or memories that structure and influence the perception of external reality. And internalized relationships between these objects, importantly. This view is largely consistent with contemporary developmental research. The work of Paul Bloom and Karen Wynne at Yale University come to mind. Their research demonstrates very early and quite sophisticated cognitive processes in very young infants. Recognition, repetition, discrimination, even some moral reasoning is present in children as young as 6 months. Klein spoke of two primary states and processes, what she termed the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. Respectively, these processes and states of mind can be thought of as fragmentation versus integration, dysregulation versus regulation, and they map neuroanatomically onto the structures called the amygdala and the hippocampus, and the functions and processes associated with these structures. So we can also think about paranoid schizoid mechanisms as a regression into a disorganized, chaotic state, and the depressive position as the recovery of order and a capacity to think. Later theorists developed the idea of there being multiple selves, sub-organizations of the personality, if you will, experienced as a seamless whole. The Scottish psychoanalyst Ronald Fairbairn presciently thought of the infant being primarily pleasure-seeking and object-oriented. And this is reminiscent of Panksepp's seeking and attachment systems. So these are sub-organizations such as the internal good mother and her counterpart, the bad mother, and the internal saboteur, which might be thought of, these might be thought about as psychological manifestations of not yet fully formed capacity for sophisticated thinking that can represent external reality, others accurately. And at this stage, the baby can only perceive parts of them, not their whole. What we call in object relations theory, part object versus whole object thinking. The English pediatrician Winnicott took this a step further and developed his epigenetic idea of the baby developing a self through the interactions with the mother, and famously said there is no such thing as a baby, only a mother and a baby. We can think of this as a co-evolution of self with mother. This is what the cognitive neuroscientist Ekaterina Fotopoulou refers to as a we mind. This is different to primary narcissism. So time limits us from a fuller exploration, but hopefully what is becoming apparent is that the psychoanalytic view of how a self develops, irrespective of its early theoretical origins, is through a process of co-construction. But let's segue more into the neuropsychoanalytic side of things now through Freud, and particularly in his 1923 writings in The Ego and the Id, where he states, first, a person's own body, and above all, its surface, is a place from which both external and internal perceptions may spring. It is seen like any other object, but to the touch, it yields two kinds of sensation, one of which may be equivalent to an internal perception. Psychophysiology has fully discussed the manner in which a person's own body attains its special position among other objects in the world of perception. On the next page, Freud continues to say the ego, this is a very famous statement of Freud's, that the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but it itself is itself the projection of a surface. And if we wish to find an anatomical analogy for it, we can best identify it with the cortical homunculus of the anatomists, which stands on its head in the cortex, sticks up its heels, faces backwards, and as we know, has a speech area on the left-hand side. So essentially here, Freud is outlining a neuroanatomical location and a neurophysiological theory of the origins of the self. Each part of the objective body is mapped, he calls it a projection of the body, and found in the part of the nervous system, the cortex, that stores memories and generates the objects/contents of consciousness. For Freud, A's two bodies are represented in this area of the brain. And what we will see is that this representation is learned, it's constructed through interaction with the environment, mainly caregivers, and is not necessarily as stable as we might like to think it is. Okay, so the work of British-based cognitive neuroscientist Ekaterina Fotopoulou, to my mind, best explains the phenomena of the development of a self, in particular this idea of an embodied self. So we are not simply an experiencing I, but this I is also an object, a combined subject-object self embedded in a biological body. Katerina talks about the self being co-constructed with the mother, usually, and this bodily aspect of self being especially influenced by what she terms affective touch, a special kind of sensory experience, a loving, tender, caressing touch. She refers to the work of Madlone et al., who identified a type of skin receptor unique to humans, which responds specifically to affective touch, gentle touch, what they term as sensitive afferent C fibers provide the neurobiological substrate for the development and function of the social brain. They call these cells low-threshold mechanoreceptors, CT cells, and they've evolved to detect and process emotional touch, especially. This always makes me think of how Jaak Panksepp said that hearing is a highly specialized form of touch, and how this resonates with how we as analysts hear and speak to the people we work with. Fotopoulou uses the famous rubber hand illusion. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, where a person is asked to put both hands on a table, and a rubber hand is placed beside one, and the experimenter strokes both hands in that gentle affective touch kind of a way, and then stops stroking the real hand, but continues to stroke the rubber hand, and the person experiences the rubber hand as their own. And this, I think, is a very good demonstration of how the boundaries of the body are mapped internally. So essentially, the ego jumps from one external object to another. Manos Securus, he also speaks about a similar phenomenon. He spoke at the Berlin conference called, the title of which was Minding the Body. And he spoke about a body swap experiment involving virtual reality and mannequins, which were essentially a whole body rubber hand illusion. What does this tell us about the self? I think it demonstrates that its development is highly contingent upon experience, in particular external experience that's mediated by a caregiver. Optimally, one that is good enough, or as Winnicott would have said, preoccupied enough with us to respond and to soothe us. So Mark Solmes's conscious id also comes to mind, and when thinking about A and the construction of an experiencing mind. In his seminal paper, The Conscious Id, Solmes identifies Freud's agency of the id to the concept of the body as a subject, the subjective affective phenomena we experience as feelings, and puts forward the view that this is the primary stuff of consciousness. The id and this primary affective phenomenal consciousness arises out of subcortical upper brain stem processes connected to body monitoring nuclei, which homeostatically monitor the biological autonomic processes of the body, which are largely unrepresented in consciousness until something goes wrong. or they move out of homeostasis, and we need to get them back into homeostasis in order to survive. Then we feel something in relation to them. The ego, on the other hand, Soames links to this body as object aspect of the self. As Freud said, the body is an object in the external world like any other object we experience. These different sensory aspects of the external world are represented in the cortex. And unimodal aspects are represented in different cortical regions, such as vision, taste, smell, touch, audition, etc. And what Freud called thing or object presentations. Soames also talks about how higher order re-representations of object presentation also develop. And these are referred to by Freud as word presentations, which are cortical. Usually, they're derived from perception and usually hearing, and these are also capable of consciousness. What makes these word presentations special is that they can also represent the relationship between object presentations and allow for abstract thinking. Spatial and temporal relationships of self fall into this category. And as we've seen from Rose's wonderful presentation, that A has a unique representation of this relationship at a neurological and psychological level. So Soames also talks about how working memory, the conscious arena where word presentations, object presentations, ideas about the body, and the subjective feeling self phenomena are experienced. Importantly, it contains affective and cognitive elements. The developmental psychologist Piaget, best known for his work on cognitive development, he is less well known for his repeated expression and exaltation that without affect, there can be no cognition. Panksepp also asserted the view for the primacy of affect in our conscious experiences, and he lamented the overemphasis of a purely cognitive view of mental experience. So what we experience repeatedly, in a way we become. So how does knowledge about the external world get in and develop in our mind brains? An area of interest Piaget referred to as genetic epistemology. So the current thinking in cognitive and affective neuroscience is through a process of, this happens through a process of memory consolidation and reconsolidation. Two leading researchers in this field, who are also advocates and affiliates of neuropsychoanalysis, Christina Alberini and Richard Lane, have demonstrated independently the importance of affect in the process of generating object presentations and word presentations, and their stability and robustness of these cortical images. And importantly, how accessing the affective component can help to modify and adjust more accurately these representations about the object experienced. This is what happened, I believe, in the work with Rosa and A, where they moved from disembodiment to embodiment, and therefore a more accurate representation of reality. And it was mediated through the relationship with Rosa. Rosa's wonderful maternal preoccupation with A, really interested in him, and he experienced that, and he missed that when she wasn't there. I hope I'm okay for time. A couple of more slides. When thinking about the spatial and temporal aspects of A's experience, the work of the Estonian-Canadian cognitive scientist Endel Tulving came to mind for me. In particular, his distinctions between the different types of human memory systems. He posits three major categories, what he called anoetic, noetic, and autonoetic. Anoetic refers to implicit, unconscious, procedural aspects of memory. Noetic is explicit, it's declarative, we can talk about it, we can say something about it, we can think about it like objects of consciousness. But it's more for facts and events, that kind of memory. And autonoetic is the one we're most interested in. It also is explicit, it's declarative, but more importantly, it's autobiographical. So it kind of binds experience of this experiencing I with things and events. So he locates these processes and functions at the subcortical, hippocampal, and parahippocampal medial temporal lobe structures associated with the theoretical limbic system. of most interest to us and to Rosa and A is Tulving's concept of mental time travel, where optimal development occurs, and these systems can allow the subject to travel mentally through time and space, which in turn develops a continuous sense and representation of self temporally and spatially. Arguably, A's unique experience of self may have its roots in this area of the nervous system. So two prominent neuroanatomical structures involved in Tulving's memory systems are the amygdala and the hippocampus, and the surrounding medial temporal cortical tissue and pathways. Both of these structures and their processes are extremely sensitive to external experiences. And when the organism is threatened, the amygdala processes are amplified and privileged. This is the affective, implicit aspects of experience, or body as subject, the affective, subjective phenomenon. And conversely, when there is regulation and calm, the hippocampus is optimal, is functioning optimally, where ego function, body as object representations are present. Ideally, both structures work in tandem and fluctuate slightly in terms of their activation and use. And there are parallels here with the sympathetic and parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. So hopefully the significance of these structures and systems and processes that emanate from them is starting to become clear, particularly on what kind of a mind can develop in response to different external experiences. So to conclude, just some thoughts and questions on what kind of factors might impact on the development of heudoscopic phenomena. So social development comes to mind. You know, and I think Irith is going to say some more about this in her presentation. It seems to be a very serious candidate for consideration. We do not have much information about A's early experiences and his experiences, you know, as an infant. But you know, rough and tumble play, learning the social rules. This provides repeated experiences and opportunities for understanding and creating body boundaries and mapping the same. Early attachment issues, the establishment of an internal working model, internal world, self-body representations, you know, and factors that affect that, you know, how present the mother was, A's own temperamental factors, and all of that. Adverse childhood experiences might impact in it. Chronic stress, persistent stress can inhibit hippocampal function and create the establishment of poor cognitive cortical functioning, and then there are effects then for, you know, self-body mapping, what Soames calls mental solids, that we can use to think and understand ourselves. And these have neurodevelopmental concomitant effects on spatio-temporal organization of the embodied self, and these have implications for mental time travel, and the continuity of the self. So they're my thoughts. I hope I haven't gone too much over time, and that you were able to hear me. So thank you very much for your time and for listening.
So let me introduce Dr. Francesco Castellet y Ballarà, who is a neurologist and psychiatrist who trained in the Italian Psychoanalytical Society. He is a full member of the SPI IPA. He teaches neuroaesthetics in the University of Tor Vergata, Rome. He has a great deal of experience of international organizations, having served in the IPSO and in the IPA as committee board member. He is also one of the he is also one of the organizers of several editions of Festival dei Due Mondi di Spoleto.
Exactly.
Psychoanalysis, art and psychoanalysis sections. His main areas of interest are psychoanalysis and neuroscience, early relational trauma and adult psychopathology, pornography, and money. He is currently the psychiatrist and psychoanalytic consultant at the Italian site of the European Space Agency. He is co-founder of the Italian Psychoanalytic Dialogues association. What an interesting combination we have here. So please do come.
Okay, now what's happening?
Please do. Welcome.
Okay. So, hello to everybody. I will start immediately with my presentation because the time limits. And by chance, I amazed the fact that my presentation will follow very well the one of Paul Moore because it's strictly linked in a way. I make some general remarks about my way of seeing psychoanalysis in these modern times that has referred as, been labeled as the science of subjectivity that, in my opinion, needs to enlarge its frame of reference. In this sense, the royal road to it is indisciplinarity and interchange with the related science, mainly affective and cognitive neuroscience, of course, philosophy of the mind, evolutionary developmental biology, and transspecies psychology. I took some excerpts from the clinical case that probably has been noticed by many of you, just to stress some affects in particular, since the affects are the royal road to understand the human mind in the present times of psychoanalysis, in my opinion. So the patient says, no, this referred to this claustrophobic fears, the panic attack, the sense of failure, the sort of depersonalization aura, and the frustration of being rejected, the sense of alienations, that was linked, that's quite interesting to me, to the disappearance of pain. So to be alienated means also to have a protection against pain. And the little news information we have about his childhood, that as a child he was a very afraid child with this kind of paranoid, in my opinion, attitude. Now the trait is outside, and his solution was to shut us down himself, to close himself to the world. In fact, he was isolated with very few friends, mainly contained by his own family. And then not by chance, though the second panic attack, or the first panic attack even more, was happened in playing basketball. That means one of the main important socialization for a child is to play with other peers. So I wonder if the main point about this patient is about relational trauma, early relational trauma. And I could ask also to Rosa, who really was in touch with him affectively, if he has any signs of this kind, like the inability to make eye contact, that means self-loathing and shame. Of course, we have seen signs of non-integration of body sensory perception, the impairment or lack of self-awareness to a certain extent, the alexithymia, the somatic reenactment of trauma via gestures, maybe, and for sure, in my opinion, dissociation and depersonalization. Back to the general, let's say, statement, of course, since also the outstanding works of Panksepp, the emotions are now considered the basic communicative tools of all of the social brains, not only humans, but in all the mammals, at least. In fact, humans, like most mammals and some insects, are essentially social animals from a neurobiological point of view. The social brain, mainly the limbic system, is common to mammals and birds. And as in the attachment systems, that is online even during the late fetal stages, is first expression, where bodily emotion are the only and the most powerful media. There is a beautiful definition, in my opinion, of a very famous primatologist, that is Frans de Waal, that says emotions should be considered as internal organs. All emotions are biological and necessary for our survival. If we share them with any other mammals at least. Not a single emotion is exclusively human. According to some experiments, it seems that some acoustics universals allow to all vertebrates to communicate their emotions in a similar way. So we share basic languages that are the emotions, and also all the, let's say, acoustic sounds that communicate those emotions. According to the most recent ethological and developmental biology researchers, language and human species' capacities for innovations arises from the capacity of our species and anthropomorphic primates for collective, that means mutual bonds, exploration and invention, not on individual brain spatial features. That means that the famous phrase of Winnicott about the relationship within the mother and the baby could be transformed in this way. There is no such a thing as a baby and a mother without a group around, a tribe, okay? So enlarging to the group. Actually, emotions could be very painful. And the most painful emotions, according also to the work of Panksepp and followers, are linked to social loss, rejection, and exclusion from the group. And has been demonstrated that the neural pathways that mediate physical pain overlap with that mediate emotional pain. So this is a strong link also from a developmental point of view. Defense mechanisms, of course, are there to alleviate emotional pain. In this sense, to promote emotional regulation and social inclusion. The two things are related very strongly. And according to the primatologist and ethologist, defense mechanisms and complex emotion are described also in chimps, bonobo, and gorillas. It's interesting, of course, the defense mechanism has been studied, are studied also from the cognitivist, and there is a convergence about its meaning, and also the definition, in the sense that, for example, this work of Barg and Chartrand in 1999 states that defense mechanisms are forms of automatic self-regulation, developed out of repeated and consistent experiences. And for example, Weiland, that is one of the fathers of the study of emotions, state also that he will use the same terms between defense, adaptation, resilience, and coping. So to make simple something that is actually absolutely not so, as a kind of table reference, we could say, in very general term, that our patient suffers mainly from affects / emotions. Emotions means always something, and usually they mean unsatisfied needs. Emotional disorders, eventually all psychopathology, entail unsuccessful attempts to satisfy needs. That means they use wrong defense mechanisms. While the main goal of psychotherapy is to help patients to learn better ways of meeting their needs, in the sense to achieve a better emotional regulation. While, on the contrary, psychopharmacology suppresses unwanted feelings without addressing the underlying needs that are causing the symptoms. In psychoanalysis, in particular, aims to reconsolidate automatized action plans. Let's go to the main topic of this presentation, that is dissociation. I could start from this very general definition by the American Psychiatric Association, and in which dissociation is disconnection between a person's thoughts, memories, feelings, actions, or sense of who he or she is. This is a normal process that everyone has experienced in his life. Examples of mild, common dissociation include daydreaming, highway hypnosis, while we are driving in the highways, or getting lost in a book or movie, all of which involve losing touch with awareness of one's immediate surroundings. During a traumatic experience, such an accident, a disaster, or crime victimization, dissociation can help a person tolerate what might otherwise be too difficult to bear. In situations like this, a person might dissociate the memory of the place, circumstances, or feelings about the overwhelming event, mentally escaping from the fear, pain, and horror. This makes it difficult to later remember the details of the experience, as reported by many disaster and accident survivors. Here are some other definitions that I will briefly report to you, especially the one about dissociation as an altered state of consciousness that is automatically triggered by external traumatic events, like in post-traumatic stress disorders, but also a little bit of differentiation from repression that is linked completely to Freud's theory of conflicts. And the other differentiation that is useful is about splitting, that is related typically of borderline personality disorders, in which there is this incapacity to integrate complex and contradictory negative and positive self or others aspect in a coherent whole. Dissociation, in this sense, could be also reframed as dissocialization, in the sense that dissociation is always a defense mechanism for social relational trauma. Natural disaster, this has been proved, are never so traumatic for the victim compared with man-made violence. Probably the mechanism of this is the destruction of the basic trust toward a co-specific, when the violence is man-made, like in war situation that is in the picture. What is relatively new is this strong link between early relational trauma and dissociation. These are the famous study by Van der Kolk, in which chronic childhood abuse and neglect causes very different mental and biological adaptation with respect to discrete traumatic events in adulthood. And Shore described the alteration of brain circuitry that lasts for life after early relational trauma, in particular reducing the prefrontal inhibitory control of the limbic system. Shore also stated very clearly that what is really traumatic is neglect. That means actually isolation. While in the abuse situation, at least a relationship between the abuser and the abused one exists. The study of the attachment link very strongly early relational trauma with disorganized or insecure attachment in the child that affect the development of mentalization and a specific deficit on self-reflection. It's interesting to say that normally disorganized attachment is between a child and a mother suffering from dissociation. So it's a kind of induction of dissociation between the mother and the child. There is a recent work by Trumbull in which he proposed a first stage of dissociation as the effect of introjection identification with the aggressor. Quoting, "One function of introjection is a persistent form of monitoring, triggered by anticipation of interpersonal danger, designed to alert and inform the victim from a dominant other perspective, the abuser. In consequence, when experiencing abuse or trauma, the victim might become stuck in an external perspective, a seeing oneself from out there, with the loss of seeing from in here. However, because early relational trauma disrupts the adaptive development of this perspective-taking process, it cannot move toward healthy integration. That means mentalization, actually. Instead, with sufficient reinforcement induced by recurrent relational trauma, it evolves into a persistent dissociative state. That was the description, in my opinion, of the Rosa's case, a persistent dissociative state. The last part of my contribution is about the fact that hard science, this is a work by Nature, October 2020, so very fresh, has been able to explore the molecular, cellular, physiological underpinnings of dissociation. This thanks to advanced imaging methods, something really amazing. If you had the chance to read this book, is really fantastic. This paper is really fantastic because they have been able to use these techniques in which you can have recording of the entire brain at the mice level, and then making a comparison with, I will say, the dissociation model of epileptic fits in some adult patients. I will show you more in detail. So the animal model was made using the ketamine that also Claudia mentioned. That is a drug that is famous for its induction of state of dissociation at a certain dosage, while if you grow with the dosage, of course, you will have the anesthetic effect. This dissociation state in mice were associated, that's the discovery, with a rhythm of 1 to 3 Hertz in the layer 5 neurons in the retrospinal cortex. That is more or less this area, as you see. I will show you. No? This is the area. This is the area that correspond to, in humans, to the deep posteromedial cortex. The human model, we say, is actually the epileptic area. If you remember also the Rosa's patient described himself as a sort of epileptic area, let's say, the personalization. And in patients with focal epilepsy, they have been able actually to record the same kind of slow wave rhythm in the corresponding area of humans in respect to the mice area of the brain. And of course, during this, it was a surgery probably going on for the epilepsy, and they could also stimulate with electrodes the same area, having the description of the dissociation symptoms on the part of the patients. This is the description, for example. No, in the left deep posteromedial cortex, the feeling of being disconnected from something. It's like being weightless in your own mind as a personality. Maybe the same way a pilot can lose control of a plane, like they can be forced out of the cockpit or not be in control of it, but still see what's happening to the whole plane. That's kinda what just happened. I got pulled out the pilot's chair, but I could still see all the gauges. You can see the information flowing, but you can't control it. You just can't see, no, from the outside. And there are some detail also of the EEG showing the slow wave rhythm. And what is amazing in a way that they have been able to record. Yeah, we are close to, okay.
Dear Francesco, it is so interesting, and I will need to tell you that you will need to stop in minutes to whenever it is possible for you.
Yeah. So it's just that if they go into detail describing the circuitry as well, and the decoupling they describe between the thalamus and the frontocortical circuitry, that could explain the fact that the people could be disconnected with autobiographically with their own emotions, at the same time being conscious, not falling into anesthesia. Anyway, the clinical implication, in my opinion, of all that is, of course, that we have physiological dissociation in our psychoanalytic setting due to the sensory deprivation of the couch that induce the mind wandering, that is a state of dissociation. Also, the silent analyst paradigm, in a way, through relational deprivation, could help emergency of unsatisfied needs. And there's also something new. There is the possibility to induce dissociation in the psychotherapeutic setting using exactly ketamine. And there are a lot of studies about this. Some of them are under scrutiny of the Federal Drug Administration to be admitted. And this is a work from a Neuropsychoanalysis, the journal, that the key phenomenon is the ego dissolution, of course, induced by the drug. That could be explained as a reversal or undoing of the ego ability to modulate the affective intensity of his relationship, but mainly to reduce the defense mechanism, the wrong defense mechanism. That's the criteria. And allowing to see oneself from other points of view, that is the psychotherapeutic, also the psychotherapist point of view, and to switch to another way of being, to try to find new solution, no? New meaning, is said. By the way, people addicted to psychedelic usually use the drug exactly on this respect. That's my personal experience. So, I will stop here. Thank you for attention.
Irith is a psychologist and supervisor also. She's organizational consultant, founder, and chairwoman of the Israeli Neuropsychoanalytic Society. I think the Neuropsychoanalytic Society is the most creative society, neuropsychoanalytic society in the world. Okay, so they produce, they set a lot of conference, exchange, supervision, school, and so on. She's founder member and board member of the International Neuropsychoanalytic Society. Are you the treasurer, I think, or not? Yeah, okay. And is a clinical psychologist and supervisor in psychotherapy, coordinates an interdisciplinary course in Tel Aviv at the university, and she has a lot of experience with the children, with clinical practitioners, and above all, with the supervision of neuropsychoanalytic clinic statements in Israel and around the world. So I give you the word.
Thank you. Thank you for making it shorter. It's good. Thank you. So my my presentation is going to be a bit different because it's going to be a kind of a Tavistokian psychoanalytic. Each one of us has made his contribution and his language and joined information from different places. So let me go with my presentation. So X is 35 years old male. From the case presentation, we know nothing about his appearances, his activities, or not too much about his history. What we know about the history finds expression in two brief but serious episodes involving experiences he had when an adolescent and which mainly relates to AX symptoms. There were two experiences linked to severe existential anxiety, separation, distress, kind of anxiety at the age of 13 and again at the age of 16, where we know that he avoided the anxieties through action by flight. We also know that one episode of existential anxiety was linked to him for failing an exam. Beyond this, we have not too many details of his past. Maybe I didn't have it when I received the paper. It changes in a way, but my working assumption is the patient's massive existential anxiety was at the center of the analyst's concern, thereby reducing attention to normal integration he had achieved in his life. Now he is on the brink of an abyss. You know that he had done all tests and neurological tests and physical tests that you can imagine. Everything there went all right. And his symptomatology was interpreted as indicating different diagnoses. I won't go into this. AX disorder is characteristic of someone who has no concept of the world of his own feelings. It reminded me, I think, Nahar poem, 2007, where he wrote, when you touch a flower, you can touch it with your finger, but better yet, you can touch it mindfully with your full awareness. X is unable to create a concept of body, and his feelings are elusive. He seemingly has theoretical concept of time, place, space, and world, but they are detached from the reality of his being. The intensity of his emotional suffering is so strong that he is unable to put into focus. Consequently, there is no prospect of him being able to control his emotions in a way that would allow him to actually feel these emotions and his sensations. The assumption is, of course, that something too powerful cannot be felt. In effect, the feelings become an act. It becomes overwhelming, explosive, and is not experienced emotionally. At this stage, it turns into a meta. In the absence of concentration and control, the patient is unable to be sensitive to his feeling, not even as cues from his soma. Thus, it is clear that the experience of the world is marked by its absence. It is devoid of existential truth, so that the patient is left experiencing contact with the world that is in effect exists in his feelings, in his brain, but is disconnected from the experience, from his experience or his sensations. Since we are short in time, I won't go into all this citation from Rosa's case presentation, but it was cited before, so I will go further. As it always amongst schizoids, some sort of connection does exist, despite the wish for detachment, so that anxiety does occasionally penetrate his awareness. The patient's psychic mechanisms work to detach him from the feeling of anxiety, but his good fortune, the defenses remain invasive, and he is unable to activate a complete delete, as Rosa mentioned in the case. The function of the patient's seeking system is amplified, continually checking out the external and the internal world, but does not succeed in creating a complete concept of the object, and therefore is unable to ally to AX fears. One of the features of attention is that an individual listening to music, for example, is capable of hearing a number of notes and is able to follow the tune. Ledoux writes that notes that this is kind of magical and incomprehensible system. So the question arises as to how the human brain can complete the form while not heard. The research that I'm conducting in the field of imitation provides, just a minute, provides a clear explanation of this issue. For example, someone who is listening to music is familiar with the tune and is also able to mumble its lyrics, even if they haven't memorized them entirely. They can also link it to the experience they had when last listening to the tune and complete it because the psychic system, functioning like a radar, operating in conjunction with imitation mechanism, constantly gathering information from the world. This mechanism locates existing structures, solid, like what Mark Solms writes, solid, not material. All right, you know, I see that you know what I'm speaking about, which serve to create new structures and concepts that help in dealing with the novel and the surprising. It enables the listener to hear and form associations, to complete the work and to produce images. But that is not how it works for AX. He is unable to join in, unable to enjoy in, to move into, like a conductor in a symphony, whom you see that he goes into the music. All the people who are playing, they are going into the music and they come back. But in order to go into the music and complete it, you need to be able to separate from where you are, not be afraid, and go into the music. This is something the AX is unable to do. So if you are able to do, it enables the listener to hear and form associations, to complete work and produce images. But that is not how it works for AX. He doesn't join, he detaches the experience from himself, and so he is left without his contents, without the feelings subsequently aroused in his various emotional system. He halts the music. The result of switching the music, I mean the emotions, is that he experiences himself as if dead. The experience does not recur as an experience of success for himself. For the patient, success is marked by calming the panic, rather than success experiencing death, as it viewed by AX. As unequivocal, this is seen by him as an unequivocal proof of his failure. So as to understand AX experience and the way in which it was built, I, at the beginning, followed three different paths. I am leaving out the neurological aspect, which was beautifully described here, beautifully described by Paul, beautifully with Francesco and Claudia. And let me go to this, to the more developmental, Tavistokian, analytic dynamic, which I have bridged with the neuropsychoanalytic emotional systems. So AX, this integration was so difficult to comprehend. As I read the case presentation, I felt that as if I was someone viewing the scene through a theater binocular, having to draw him back and forth, taking him closer to me and far away, zooming in, zooming out to what I was gazing at. All of this so as to create clarity. And indeed, at one end of the picture became clearer and integration was created. I tried to imagine beyond the text what the images of his objects were. And the images I created in my head were of accompanying him as a child, meaning separation distress, and looking for the object as well as of me escorting him with care system, with the care system as an adult. You can see it is repeated in the way Rosa was treating him, like the combination of having separation distress and care kind of complementary to this system. This is what he missed. What are the objects he is confronting and dealing with? How is his emotional and interpersonal meeting with them conducted? What use does he make of his object? Do they exist for him? Or are they sort of absent member of his family in his life? I knew from the notes about the flight at the age of 13 and what he had done at 16 when he failed the exam. I thought that his inner need was to be in a room and try to think why that's so. Which of his inner walls had fallen? So that he had to create alternative stable structures so as to be able to firmly place himself in the world. From this it is evident that we are describing a hurtful, cruel, merciless superego in a sensitive and ambitious child who is making an effort beyond his capacity to respond to unreasonable external demands on the one hand, and powerful, uncontrolled inner feelings and high sensitivity. We might even call it hypersensitive. A child who forfeits the ability to control feelings via the emotional mechanisms and has to resort to understandable ways, special methods of behavior that will enable him to exert that control over his emotions, which is to say that from the outset, his emotional control system has been unable to bear his extreme emotions and shuts down his automatic actions, depersonalization. This leaves the patient, this is the secondary defense mechanism he's using against the separation, distress, panic. This leaves the patient to develop all sorts of innovative ways in order to deal with the intensity of the pain. This is why he preferred to flee to a room that is supposed to actualize the system, control it, and put the inner structures in place. It is even evident from AX behavior that his failure in the exam dealt a cruel blow to the integrity of his inner world, as Claudia, as you were speaking about that. As a consequence, the patient's defense mechanism is unable to be sensitive to his feelings or to cope with the panic attacks he experiences, which are so frequently mentioned in the presentation. This reminded me also of Tastin's paper discussing autistic children. What she's writing there is, a hard shell-like encapsulation is the psychodynamic differential diagnostic feature uniquely specific to autistic children. By pressing against the hard wall or against inanimate object, or by turning their back on people they feel fused and acquainted with, hard sensation thus engendered. It is due to the sense of not being able to differentiate between himself and the world, which leads him to construct such walls between himself and his body structure that function as powerful mechanisms of inner death. This phenomenon is not new. AX building various structures that will help him create some boundary, some solid structures. What I mean is what we simply call he is engaging in object relation with an object, but who is the object? How does he deal with the object? The object is his own mind, and he believes that it is going away. It is leaving him. He is constantly in separation distress, afraid to lose himself, his mind and his body. He believes that if his mind is empty of contents and images, that although he will manage, he nonetheless finds this emptiness disturbing. The contents and images are co-creation of the mind. It is the glue that keeps it all together. Losing the essence of object results in having no object, and usually with either depression or high levels of anxiety, which complements the depression. Therefore, when in therapy, he is afraid to do the very same things, to repeat what he is used to do with his objects. Like the dream, that beautiful dream that he finally lets this beautiful woman come in, meaning Rosa, I suppose, and all the idea of what she's bringing to him. He discovers that all the symptoms return when she's gone. So I'll read you this citation from the paper. He is not afraid of contents or objects, but he is afraid of losing this pattern, the continuity of the self. Once upon a time, he gave himself a pattern by writing everything he had to do during the day in a notebook. They were maps of well-defined schedule and spaces in which to act, trying to manage somehow this confusion and loss of objects and loss of the feeling of reality by scheduling in a way. I also, do we have time? What do you say, Rosa?
You can go. We have time. Go.
All right. Then I go. I just let you offer a neuropsychoanalytic viewpoint aided by the imitation system, which I developed as a neuropsychoanalytic concept. I won't go too deep into it, but this is the work I'm doing with my PhD. And let me tell you what the imitation system mechanism is. It is the primary learning mechanism, enabling us to understand the world. It begins in the womb and continues to function throughout life. This mechanism searches for structures through which it will be possible to cope with a chaotic world. You were mentioning, Francesco, the VAL. So it goes with the work the VAL is doing, exactly. And find solutions in order to assimilate that world and understand it better. The mechanism is activated by the seeking system. This system resembles a radar, implicitly assimilating both needed and unnecessary information from the world. And it puts it very in the peri-aqueductal gray. It turns together additional information and changes until it creates a new concept which can be assimilated, making it possible to even automate it and add it to the existing structure. AX experienced uncontrollable panic anxiety. He repeatedly probes his own experience and by means of his probing reconstructs it again and again. The reconstruction becomes the way in which he chooses to modulate his feelings. The psychic system functions at full capacity and is in fact overflooded. This continues until he succeeds in halting the experience so that he remains lacking contents and lacking images, depersonalization. This is the defense of depersonalization. The choice to accept the absence of contents and representation is evident of the level of his panic anxiety that involves the loss of boundaries between the inner and outer world, between the subjective and the objective. And we all remember that the panic grief system is kind of addictive system. We do it again and again and we cannot stop, okay? And it goes again to Claudia's question, whether he would need some kind of medication, I believe, or not. But it is this addiction of repeating again and again, of looking for this object that he cannot make something out of it unless he gets the help from Rosa. Then when he puts the emotion, then it is getting linked and it becomes together. It is the incapacitating, what he's doing is an incapacitating imitation of no containing object. And this is the problem, no containing object for him. From the book of Psalms, let me just read, I'll read it in Hebrew and I'll go to English. גם אם אלך בגיא צל מוות, לא אירא רע, כי אתה עמדי. What they're saying is that though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. But he feels alone. He doesn't have nobody there, not even his belief, nothing, just by himself. And so the body is the best partner he can choose, you know. His self somewhere there. The loss of imagery and contents choice apparently entails the absence of the ability for abstract thought. His injury is to be found on the border between the neurological and the mental experience. This border is constantly at risk of disintegrating. This is a danger that emanates from the emotional load flooding the system and endanger the existing structures. These structures are liable to be drowned, overrun by the intensity of the experience of desperate separation anxiety, and are likely to disturb and damage the sense of time and place. X lives in a very turbulent world. I assume that he had the kind of childhood in which there was activity, but with emotionally detached parents. This is just what I believe. X is aware of the difficulty. He's a person of high intellectual ability, reporting on the problem of controlling his emotions with bad containment. He explains how he senses that he has lost his way in life, informing of his fear that he won't ever find himself. The solution sought by AX leads him to the very edge of his ability to resolve the difficulties in the world. He is unable to create emotional concepts that would contain his distress, would enable him to achieve a better scrutiny of himself. All right then, I believe that the therapy offered by Rosa, the constancy, the setting, the emotional way you stay with her, this is what will mark out his pathway to recovery. So thank you very much, Rosa, for your work and case presentation.